Welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, I don't just make pottery, I make resources such as books and courses for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about me sharing everything I've learned with you, and I can't wait to get started. Let's go! Hello, so before we get on with the episode, I wanted to tell you about two completely free guides that I've made just for you about pottery. And the first guide is called How to Make a Pottery Glaze. So if you've ever been curious about how to make your own pottery glaze, this guide will show you exactly how to make your own glaze from start to finish. It tells you all the ingredients you need. It tells you step by step how to make the glaze, how to stay safe when glaze making, and it's got a stoneware glaze recipe in there. And if you've been curious about how to fire pottery, I have also made a guide on electric kiln firing. So this guide will tell you all the different terms that's used in like kiln firing, and what they mean, and it also takes you through the exact firing schedule that I use to do my bisque firing and also stoneware glaze firing. So it's got all the temperatures in there, all the timings in there, and both of these guides are available from the Oxford Clay website at www.oxfordclay.co.uk/resources for potters. Okay, let's get on with the episode. Hello, welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. So I'm your host, Catherine Tomlinson, and love talking about pottery, and I love being here with you talking about pottery. So in today's episode, I'm going to be talking to you about the 5 different types of mould that you can use in pottery. So we're not talking like mould, like kind of mouldy bread or something. We're talking about the kind of mould that can allow you to make the same shape over and over again. So these are so good in pottery, so helpful for potters, because they let you either make like a set of something, or they let you save time on your making process, so you can kind of like make the basic shape of something and then pour all your creativity into like glazing it, or like adding bits onto it, or cutting bits out of it, or they enable you to make the same thing over and over again. So for example, if you want to sell your work in a shop or something, it really enables you to make a kind of consistent product for customers, as consistent as pottery kind of can be. And obviously you can throw shapes in a consistent way, but mold making is another way of basically creating a consistent product over and over again. So yeah, molds, they're amazing. I love molds. You can make your own mold. You can buy molds. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to be talking about, the 5 different types. Just to start, essentially, molds in pottery are mostly made from plaster of Paris. So this is because this is like this kind of magic combination between clay and plaster of Paris, where basically plaster of Paris, when clay touches plaster of Paris, the plaster of Paris starts to draw the water from the clay into the plaster of Paris body, so into the mold body basically. And what happens then is the clay, as you know, clay shrinks when it dries. Sometimes it can shrink by up to sort of like 10% when it dries. It's even more actually. Some clays shrink even more. So as the clay gets the water drawn out and it sort of starts to dry, it starts to shrink in the mold, and it's that point that you can actually then take your shape out of the mold. So that's essentially what is happening when you make something with a mold. The water's drawn out, the clay shape changes slightly, gets a little tiny bit smaller, and then that allows you to then remove the shape from that mold. So that's the essential process that's happening. And there are actually other molds you can use that are made from different substances, which we'll go on to we'll go on to in this episode, and they're also really fantastic for pottery. But generally, when you hear potters like talking about molds, or maybe you like you've seen them maybe in a community pottery setting or educational pottery setting, those are the molds that will be used. They'll be basically big blocks of plaster, and then there'll be a shape which has been cast into that mold that then enables you to then use the mold and create that shape in clay. Okay. So, right, let's get on to the different types of molds. Okay, so the first type is, and this is the one which well, I certainly started with this type when I was first learning how to do pottery. This was such a good thing to practice. So this is the first type of mold. It's called a press mold, and press molds are essentially the concept is basically you're pressing clay into a mold. Okay, so they're usually just one part mold, so they'll just be one block of plaster, and then what you're doing is you're either rolling out coils and pressing them into that press mold, or you're rolling out a flat piece of clay. This is what I did when I made something. First of all, in a press mold, I basically rolled out a piece of clay, and then I pressed gently gently. It's quite tricky to do in a bowl actually to try and press a flat piece of clay into a kind of bowl shape. But that's essentially what you're doing. You're very gently kind of pressing it into that sort of depressed shape. So it's usually a kind of, the one I made was like a kind of oval bowl shape, but they're usually bowl shapes or dishes, a flat plate or a flat dish or a bowl, because that allows the shape then to come out of the mold like very easily. And also it means that you can work really well with like a flat rolled out piece of clay. That works really well in press molds. So another way of using a press mold actually is to kind of create a kind of design out of clay and then press that into the side of the mold. So for example, I made another pot when I was learning how to make pottery, where I basically if you think about like a roll of clay, quite a thin roll of clay, that I just rolled out on the table, and then I curled it up like a little kind of snail shell or something type shape, and then I pressed that into the side of the mold, and then I did that all the way around, and then I smoothed the inside, to kind of get rid of all the lines on the inside. And then when I took the shape out, when I let the shape dry, the clay dry a little bit, the water had been drawn out by the plaster, and I turned the bowl out, you could see these kind of little like snail shell type designs on the outside of the bowl. So that's another way to use press molds. You can press kind of like like shapes that you've cut out or rolled out or made into the sides of that mold, and you can make really beautiful like decorative designs that way. So that's essentially a press mold. The essential process with a press mold is pressing the clay in, and then usually what happens is you kind of would gently cut around the side of any overhanging clay. Usually you would use like a wooden tool. You wouldn't use like a metal tool, because metal tools can actually damage plaster molds. So you would just very gently cut the sides, and then you would wait for it to dry, like I was saying, and it will go a bit smaller, and then you can turn your piece out, and then you can do anything you want to, like finish it off by like a bit of sponging, or so like making the base maybe flatter, or just sponging any little bits off, or getting rid of any sharp edges and stuff like that. So that's a press mold. Okay. And then very similarly, there's also a mold. This is a second type of mold. The second type of mold is called a hump mold. Okay, so this is a very similar concept to a press mold. The only difference is that a hump mold is effectively the other way round. So instead of pressing clay into the mold, you're actually like laying clay on top of a hump. If you imagine like a hill, like a very, very tiny hill, that's essentially what you're doing. So it will be like, maybe they're usually used for like kind of quite shallow dishes. They work really well as hump molds. So again, it will be usually like a flat rolled out piece of clay, like a flat piece of clay. And then they're just gently kind of draped over this hump mold, creating, when it kind of dries and you take the piece off, it's then inverted, like, turn it the right way up, basically. And then you've got a kind of bowl shape. So yes, like I said, they're really good. They're used for kind of like dishes, generally quite sort of flat dishes, because it's quite tricky to like drape that clay over in a way that kind of doesn't like break the clay and stuff. So they are generally used for like kind of shallow dishes. But essentially, it's exactly the same type of concept as a press mold, but it's just like the other way round. So it's like a hill instead of a kind of ditch, if you know what I mean. Okay, so right, okay, so the next type of mold, and this is also a plaster mold, is a slip casting mold. Oh, I love slip casting. So I do a lot. I do quite a lot of slip casting, and I generally do my slip casting in one part molds. So with slip casting, you can have lots of different types of molds. So they can either be like one part, and that is basically essentially just like a press mold or a hump mold. It'll be like one piece of plaster, and what you're doing is you're taking liquid clay like slip, which you specially make with a special chemical called deflocculant, which basically makes the clay really runny. So it turns it from a kind of sticky kind of slip clay into like a pourable state, and it's magical when you watch it. Like, I don't know, one time I watched this video on YouTube, and it was people making slip, and as soon as they added the deflocculant, it was incredible. It's like this chemical that you add, and you hardly need any, and it turns clay from basically almost high, sort of like a kind of sticky substance, into like this like pourable liquid clay. It's absolutely incredible, like magic. So essentially that's what a slip is. It's a special casting slip, so you need a deflocculant in that slip, and what is happening is that liquid clay is then being like poured into a mold. So if you want to make a kind of like a bowl shape or something, some kind of like dish or shallow bowl, one part molds for slip casting will work really well. However, if you want to make something which has any kind of overhang, and by overhang I mean something that would effectively stop that piece from coming out. So if you think about like pouring liquid into like say like a glass of water or something, you're pouring the liquid in. If the glass has straight sides, that's fine, you can just pull the thing out. If the glass, however, has a kind of wider base and a narrower neck, you're not going to be able to pull the shape out of that mold. So anything which is like wider at the base and narrower at the top is going to need more than one part to the mold, and that is because you'll have like basically the two halves that will come together and then create the space for that shape to be cast. And then what happens is, to get the shape out after you've cast it, you basically pull the two sides apart, and that's how you release the shape. So this is the same with like anything with anything with an overhang. So if you think about so a lot of like pottery that you'd find in shops, say like in the supermarket, like a mug or something, they will be slip cast. It's generally the kind of industrial go-to process for making ceramics today. So quite often things like mugs, if you get them sort of mass-produced mugs, they will be cast with the body and the handle all in one go. And sometimes, occasionally, you can actually see the line where the two sides come together. So if you ever sort of like have a look at just those kind of like mugs, that you'd get just from like the general store, like homeware store. If you look really carefully, you might be able to see where the two sides of the mold have come together. So generally they're cast with the body of the mug and the handle all in situ. And so they will need to be cast in a two-part mold, because that handle's not going to be able to come out basically if it was just like a one-part mold. So you can actually get very complex molds as well. So there's this really good book on slip casting and mold making, which I talk about quite a lot on this podcast, but it's such a fantastic book. It's by Andrew Martin, and it taught me basically how to slip cast, and it's fantastic. It's all about like how to make molds and how to make slip and how to like put those two things together and actually cast things. So in that book, Andrew Martin like goes through how to make loads of different molds, and some of them are very complex because they might have overhangs in like kind of like there might be one part that needs two parts of the mold that come together, and then there might be like a main bit that needs another two parts of the mold that come together. So I think in his book, I think there's even one where he makes a 4-part mold or something, where it's like, you've got the base, and then you've got this one bit and another bit, and then like the main kind of body bit. It's really amazing. So so generally, if you buy a mold from you can buy slip casting molds. If you buy those from like a pottery supplier, they will generally be, so like say for example you're casting a vase, they will quite often be 3-part molds, because you've got the 2 sides of the vase, and they quite often have a base as well, which needs to go in as well. So you hold all of those together with either these kind of big like rubber bands, or it can be a mold strap. So essentially it's kind of like a very strong strap that you like kind of clip together, and then it holds the mold all together, and then you can pour the slip in and pull the slip out again. So so the way slip molds work, I've just realized I haven't really talked about that, is you pour the slip in, you wait for a certain amount of time. So it can be with some clays, so you can cast in all different clays. You can cast in earthenware, stoneware, you can cast in porcelain. Some clays will be very quick to cast. So bone china, for example, I don't use bone china, but that'll be very, very quick. It only takes a few minutes basically to cast. And then there'll be other clays like stoneware clay. I actually cast in stoneware clay, and that takes a lot longer. It takes, it can take up to sort of like 45, even 50 minutes to cast in stoneware. Generally, like I don't want my dishes like too thick, and I like quite sort of hopefully quite thin dishes. And so what I cast, the time I use to cast is about 35 minutes to 40 minutes, depending on like the weather. Sometimes if it's like hotter, sometimes if the molds are very dry, it takes less long. Sometimes if the molds are wetter, if I've already cast like that morning or something and I'm trying to cast again, it will take a lot, take a bit longer. It can be like sort of 45 minutes. So generally that's a slip casting mold, and that is like mold number 3. So mold number 4 is called a Sprig mold, and Sprig molds are generally used for so generally they're made of plaster again, and generally they're used for like something small, like a small design that you will then so you generally press clay into them, and then the clay shrinks a little bit, and you can then like turn it out, and generally it will be like something quite small, like the shape of like an animal or something, and then you can then put that as a design onto your pot. So they're generally they're like for little tiny kind of little sprigs, like little tiny things that you would then use in like a decorative way, like on your pot. So that's a Sprig mold. Okay, so there are plaster Sprig molds. And you would use kind of like you would use a slip to kind of and score it, and then that's how you would kind of stick a sprig onto your pot, and then like you could like smooth around the edges to make sure it didn't come off. And the two things would have to be like the same level of dryness, if you're joining them together, so that they didn't crack off basically when they were different. If they're different levels of dryness, then they can like crack apart. So that's the kind of thing when you're joining a sprig, something decorative onto your pot, then you just need to make sure they're the same level of dryness basically. Mold number 5, and this is like for me like the most exciting discovery that I've made, one of the most exciting discoveries I've made in pottery so far, is silicone molds. Okay, so on the face of it, you think, I can't use a silicone mold for pottery. The silicone is not going to be absorbing water from that clay. So, you think there's no way I'm going to be able to like get that clay thing out of that silicone mold, right? So this is what I thought first of all, is like, it's not going to work. Basically, I saw loads of silicone molds used in the cake making industry. So, this is like a huge industry, and it's basically people making, it's like sugar craft basically. So people are using a kind of icing fondant, and they're pressing icing fondant into silicone molds, and they're making absolutely incredible things. Like, those silicone molds are very intricate. There's like a few companies that do them. You can get like animals, butterflies. I use dragonflies and butterflies in my work. You can get, gosh, just like, and think of any animal, you name it, and it's got it'll have a mold, a silicone mold, and quite often they're quite flat, so they work really well. Essentially, it's like a Sprig mold, but it's like a silicone version of it. So they're quite flat. So basically what I do is I just like press the clay into them, and then I turn it, I wait for the clay to dry a little bit, and I can turn it out, and then I can then stick in exactly the same way as a plaster Sprig mold. I can stick that design onto my pots. So I basically stick a dragonfly onto the middle of quite a lot of my dishes, or butterflies, also flat design, and it works really, really well. You get like a beautiful kind of raised design, and then I like paint it with some glaze and stuff, and they just look so good. So here's my top tip when using a silicone mold. Okay, so when I was learning how to do this, and I was like, how do sugar crafters use silicone molds? And there's some really good videos out there. Like, quite a lot of the manufacturers of silicone molds will make videos, and you'll be able to learn, how is the ideal way to press fondant into these molds, because clay and fondant are very similar texture. So if you can press fondant into them, you can press clay into them. And what they do is they get, so I've seen on one of the videos, I saw them use this kind of like bag, little kind of fabric bag full of corn flour, or cornstarch, I think they use. So they basically puff the little puffy bag of cornstarch into the silicone mold, which delivers a very kind of fine layer of corn. So I use corn flour. So very fine layer of corn flour into the silicone mold, and it literally just like coats the side of it in corn flour. And then when the sugar crafter presses their fondant into the mold, they can turn it out. It's like basically got this kind of powdered surface that basically it stops the fondant from sticking to the silicone mold. So here was me, thought, maybe I could try this myself. And I didn't have one of those like little puffy bags, so I thought, well, why don't I just like use a paintbrush and see if that works. So basically I used a synthetic makeup brush, just like you would use for like blusher or like, foundation. And I dusted a little bit of corn flour, which I just got from the supermarket. So just dusted. You hardly need any. In fact, less is more with this, because the more I found that I put in the mold, the more it would kind of obstruct the design of like the clay when I pressed it in. So you just need a very fine dusting. You can even, if you add too much, just tap the mold out again, and then the corn flour will just like come out again. And then what I do is I get some clay which is not really, really soft, but you don't want it so hard that it's kind of like cracking. So you kind of want something in between where it's kind of so you don't want it leather hard, obviously that's too hard, and you don't want it like really, really, really soft, because then it will just take ages to dry in the mold. So kind of somewhere in between those two. And then I just basically use my finger or thumb and just press the clay into the mold. And then I use something smooth, like could be like plastic kidney, or an old like bank card or something. That's what I use. I use like an old bank card, and I basically just scrape the top of the clay off so it's completely flush with the top of the silicone mold. And then I wait, depending on the weather. If it's like a hot day or something, this process is quicker, and sometimes it can be like too quick, like, well, I wasn't ready, it's drying too much, because it's very thin. The design I use is a dragonfly, and the wings are very, very thin, so sometimes it dries like too quickly. But if you're just doing it like inside or something, it can take quite a while. It might be like 20 minutes or something, maybe even 30 minutes. And then what I then do is I turn it out onto a tea towel. because it's like a really nice soft surface for it just to be turned out. And the really good thing about silicone molds is that they bend, so you can just kind of like bend the sides of the mold, and although they're not drawing the water out of the clay is still drying sort of like in the atmosphere, so you can like turn it out. And then you're left with your kind of like design. You kind of like, tapping it a little bit, kind of just, like, using your fingers or something just to kind of try and like, encourage the design out of the mold and then onto the tea towel. And then you've got your kind of like dragonfly or whatever, animal, whatever, butterfly or something. Like I said, you can get like so many different molds, so many different designs, animals. You can get textures as well. So they do this, it's so cool. They do like a dragon skin one. It's amazing. They do like a kind of pearl one. There's like little shells you can get. Literally, think of something, you name it, and there's a silicone cake designing mold for it for Sugarcraft. And then I basically just do the same process, like use slip and stick that kind of as if like it was just made in a plaster Sprig mold. I just then stick it onto my pot. Wow. So those are the 5 different types of mold in pottery. So some are used decoratively, some are used for the kind of main body of the pot, some are used with like wet clay, just normal wet clay, and then some are used with a liquid slip. It's so much fun to be had with molds in pottery, and I've loved talking to you about them. So let's do a quick summary at the end, because I love when people do that. On the podcast I listen to, I really like when people do a summary. So I'm like, what was I just listening to? Oh, here we go. Here's the 5 things. Okay, so different types of molds, 5 different types of molds. Number 1, press mold. So this is when you would use like wet clay for this. You would either roll it out or just press a design into a plaster press mold. Mold 2, hump mold, exactly the same methodology, but generally you would drape something over a kind of hump shape, and then when that's dry, you can then take it off. When it's leather hard, you can take it off, turn it over, and you'll have kind of like a bowl shape or a dish shape. Number 3, slip casting mold. So these are kind of like specialist molds for pouring liquid clay into. They need to be held together. If they're multi-part molds, they can either be 1-part molds, they can be 2, 3, 4-part molds, depending on how complex the shape is. Liquid clay is like poured inside, you leave it for a bit, and then you pour it out again, and leaves a clay shape. And then you remove the sides of the mold and you're left with your clay shape. And then mold number 4 is a sprig mold. So these are generally like used for little designs, and they're made out of plaster. And you can kind of press clay into it, just press wet clay into it, and then turn the shape out, and then stick those on your pot. And then the 5th one is a sprig mold, but it's a silicone sprig mold. And these are from the cake decorating industry for Sugarcraft, and they're really fantastic. You can use them with clay, but just make sure you dust a little bit of like corn flour in that mold first. And again, it's the same principle. You're just pressing clay in, and then you're just maybe scraping the top with something soft, nothing metal, just kind of like a nice soft old bank card or something, to make that top completely flush with the surface. And then you're just turning that shape out and sticking it on your pot. So those are the 5 different types of molds in pottery. And thank you so much for joining me for this episode. I've loved talking to you about molds, love molds, and have loads of fun in pottery, making your stuff with molds or not, or just wishing you very happy potting until the next episode. Goodbye. Thank you so much for joining me for the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Oxford Clay or eco-conscious pottery, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website. There's books, e-courses, there's a blog on there, loads of other podcast episodes, and I can't wait to share it with you. The web address is oxfordclay.co.uk. I'll see you over there.